Hello and welcome to this introduction to the French defense. I will touch on most of the main lines. Of course, I can't cover everything, so if I miss anything, leave comments, or if there are any variations that you would like to see more details of, leave some comments and I'll try and come up with a new video to cover those. So let's begin. The French defense begins with e4 and then e6 by black is the French defense. And the French defense is a pretty solid opening for black to play. It can end up being positional or tactical, closed or open, so there's a lot of options in this French defense. And so normally white will respond to the e6 pawn move with d4, controlling the center. And that's done normally because black did not move e5 or c5 to control this d4 square. So most often white will put both his pawns in the center. Now, if we go back to e4, e6, there are some other options that white could play here. He could bring his knights out and hold back this d pawn, but most often he will take the center. And so black normally fights back, trying to hold control in the center as well. And a lot of play will revolve around these central pawns. And so with this e4 pawn being attacked, generally white will move knight to c3, protecting this e4 pawn. And white has other options, and I'll get back to those. But if he plays knight to c3, protecting the e4 pawn, then play may continue with the Winauer variation of the French defense, a counterattacking variation where this the bishop moves to b4, pinning the knight to the king and putting more pressure on the center here, because now the knight cannot protect this central e4 pawn and black can threaten to capture here. And so white can push this pawn forward, relieving the pressure in the center. And so the game may continue with this counterattack by black. And many times in the French defense, you'll see these locked up pawns in the center and play takes place on the wings. And so this c5 pawn push occurs quite often in the French defense. The pawn attacks the d4 pawn, and so in the French defense you can have a fight for this d4 pawn in the center. And so here the game will continue with a3, forcing this bishop to make a decision to either retreat or capture. And most often the bishop will capture, and this doubles up white's pawns here on c2 and c3. So his pawn structure is broken on the queen side, but black has lost the bishop pair. And now the knight moves, freeing up black with the option to castle kingside. And also from here this knight can possibly jump into the f5 square. And here we have the poison pawn variation of the Winauer variation of the French defense. And so here the queen moves out to g4, attacking this g7 pawn, and black has to decide what to do here. He could prevent this by either moving his king to f8, pushing the g6 pawn, or even possibly moving knight to g6. But many times black will let the queen capture this pawn, and it may go like this, queen to c7. So in this win-hour variation of the French defense, it can get really crazy with attacking on both sides. So now the queen is over here attacking down the c-file, and so there'll be a lot of action on this side while white can counterattack over here, attacking the g-pawn, and we'll see how it progresses here. So queen captures, and the queen is kicked over by this rook, capturing another pawn. And so black counterattacks in the center. And now after this pawn is captured on d4, black is also threatening a fork down the c-file, capturing the c3 pawn, forking the king and the rook. And so white will move his knight, protecting this c3 pawn and preventing this fork, and also attacking this black pawn on d4. And so play may continue with more pressure in the center. And so white moves to f4, defending this central pawn, which the knight is attacking and the queen was attacking. And so further development by black. The queen repositions to the center to help cover everything and defend. And black captures the c3 pawn. And so we see in the win-hour variation, it's a little crazier, more attacking on both sides. Even now the kings are still in the center, and it's hard to tell what the kings will do, if they'll stay in the center or try and castle. Black may possibly castle queen side as his king side is broken open. White could castle king side, but it's so open there that rooks may have play down these G and H files. So the win-hour defense, or excuse me, win-hour variation of the French defense can lead to some quite interesting tactical positions with a lot going on. And so now I'm going to go back here to the beginning, and we'll take a look at some other possibilities. Okay, so e4, e6, d4, d5, and we played knight to c3, and it led to the win-hour variation of the French defense. And here white has other options. Sometimes he will play knight to d2 instead. And so the difference between this and knight to c3 is that by moving to d2, it leaves the option open of not blocking this c-pawn, and that pawn can push forward to defend this d4 pawn, which we saw in the last game was involved in an attack in the center when the c-pawn moved to c5 to attack it. So the game here will continue with knight to f6, attacking the center e4 pawn. And we have another push by white, gaining space in the center. And so the knight retreats. And then development by white. And here, once again, we have this c5 pawn push, which is a common theme in the French defense. And so because white moved the knight to d2 and did not block this c-pawn, now the c-pawn is able to fortify this d4 pawn that's being attacked. And so further pressure on this d4 pawn. Many times there will be a battle in the center revolving around this d4 pawn in the French defense. and more protection by white. And finally, black captures, white recaptures. And now we see a pawn attack with this f6 pawn push attacking the e5 pawn. And so whenever there's a pawn chain, usually you want to attack the base of a pawn chain. And black has already done that. And so now he changes focus and attacks the top of the pawn chain. And so let's see how white responds. White captures because the pressure was building on this center pawn. And so after a recapture, we have castle by white, bishop to d6, developing and preparing to castle for black. And white repositions his knight to a better spot on f3, castle, and bishop to f4. And so in this position, we see both sides are mostly developed, and once again, a fight for the center. The pawns have traded more in this position than the last variation we looked at. But once again, we have a battle raging in the middle, and the pieces are fighting for positioning. Here we have this hole on the e5 square, which the knights, bishop, white will be fighting to control this area. And we also see that the bishop on c8 is blocked in, and that's a common theme in the French defense for black, is that by having this pawn on e6, many times this bishop will be locked in behind his pawns. And so this is one of the weakest pieces for black in the French defense. So in this position, he may attempt at some time to push this pawn forward and release this bishop. And so in this game, it looks like there'll be a few more moves by each side, maybe fighting along this open c file. Both sides may try and control that, along with much tension in the center. And black may also try and get activity down this f file for his rook, since that is open as well. And now let's go back and take a look at some other possibilities. In this variation we just looked at, the knight moved to d2, but there are other options. After e4, e6, d4, d5, we looked at knight to c3 and then knight to d2. But there are other options here for white. White may play e5 immediately, and this is the advanced variation of the French defense. And here white immediately gains space. He prevents this knight from moving to f6, and so black may immediately once again push to c5, attacking the central pawn. And so white will protect it with his pawn. And then we have more pressure being applied on this d4 pawn by the knight. And white moves to fortify the center, and further development by both sides. And here, a move that seems a little unusual, moving the knight to the edge, but white would like to reposition this to c2 to help fortify this d4 pawn and aid in the fight in the center. And now the knight repositions to help fortify this d4 pawn. And the queen applies more pressure, and white castles. And so this is a possibility of how this advance variation in the French defense may play out. The center is locked up. White has more space because of his advanced pawn, but there's usually a battle that rages around this d4 pawn in the center. And before I go too further into this variation, let's look at something else, another possibility. So back to the beginning, e4, e6, d4, d5, and we briefly touched on the knight to c3 move here, the knight to d2 move, and the advance variation. And so another possibility is the exchange variation, in which immediately white just captures in the center, black recaptures, and here this exchange variation may be something white would play to take a French defense player into something they normally don't see. Because the exchange variation, it's usually not played as much because white basically gives up his space advantage in the center, and pretty much the only advantage white has here is his first move. So he's basically one move ahead of black, and he has to find some advantage by getting his pieces out a little bit faster than black. So play may continue with knight to f3, and immediately the bishop moves out to pin this knight. So h3, putting the question to the bishop on what it will do, if it will capture the knight or retreat. So if the bishop retreats, we have bishop to e2, breaking the pin on the knight. Further development. And here, the knight jumps into the center and also reveals an attack on this bishop. So the bishop captures, queen captures, knight development, castling by black. And so both sides are developing, racing to get their pieces out. And another fight for this e5 outpost here for this knight. So the bishop helps fortify that. And here, rook to e8, placing this rook on the open file. And so the queen moves off of that open file to try and avoid any surprises later from this rook barreling down that e file. And exchanges in the middle. And the knight repositions, allowing this rook to have the open file and attacking the bishop. And so the bishop retreats, knight development, and we have black slowly positioning his pieces toward the king side. The queen is under attack, so the queen must retreat. And c6. So here we have a position where it's pretty even. It looks like a battle may rage down this e file, so both sides may fight for control of this e file and try and maneuver their pieces. But in the exchange variation, the positions are usually equal, and both sides will try and better position their material to gain some type of advantage. But that may be harder in this position since the pawn structure is more even, and the e file right now is the only area open to both sides. Okay, and now that we looked at that exchange variation, let's go back and see what other possibilities there are. And so after e4, e6, d4, d5, We looked at knight to c3, knight to d2, e5, the advanced variation, the exchange variation in the middle. And so, let's see, make sure I don't miss anything here because I tried to cover quite a bit of information. Okay, so now it looks like we can go back to the knight to c3 variation. This is the Chigorin variation of the French defense. And actually here in the computer section, it claims this is a queen's pawn opening with the Chigorin variation. But we have the French defense with this knight to c3 move, and we looked at the Winauer variation where the bishop comes down to b4, pinning this knight to the king. And so now let's take a look at something else. Instead of bishop to b4, we have a possibility of knight to f6. And so here, one possibility for white is to push forward in the center immediately, chasing this knight, and so the knight retreats, and the game may continue with f4, controlling the center with backing up this e-pawn. Because the knight has moved to c3, this c-pawn cannot protect d4. So if there's a c5 push and a capture of this d4 pawn, it will not be able to protect this e5 pawn, and so that's why the f4 pawn push is good to help bolster this e5 pawn. And so c5, the attack in the middle that we've seen quite often in the French defense, and knight to f3 to help cover the center. And a lot of times, if white can't keep his pawns in the center and black captures these pawns and gets rid of them, many times white will replace his pawns in the center with pieces, and so his pieces may be able to jump into these squares, the d4 and e5 square, and move into a better position in the center of the board. And so here, knight to c6 by black, fighting for the center, bishop to e3 to help bolster that center position, and exchanges. And so here we see that exchange in the center, and this f3 knight jumps into this central position, and a fight over that d4 square. And so here black has castled, and white castles queenside. So this can lead to an interesting battle where opposite side castling has occurred. And generally when that happens, there will be a battle on opposite sides and a race where black may race to push his pawns and pieces down the queen side to attack white, and white does the opposite over on the king side. And also it's interesting to look at the pawns in the center. If you notice how black's pawns are all pointing down towards the queen side, generally it's better to attack in the direction that your pawns are pointing, because as these pawns point down towards this queen side, there will be more space over here in which the pieces can jump in and attack. And for white as well, normally he has this pawn on d4, a pawn on e5, and they aim up to the queen side, and he can try and push his, or excuse me, up to the king side, and he can try and push his king side pawns up here for an attack. And here we see the pawns beginning to move on the queen side for an attack on white's king, and white moving his pawns to try and put pressure on black's kingside. And so we've seen how that opening may play out here, where they've castled on opposite sides, and then there's a push and a race on those opposite sides to see who can break through first. And so if we go back and look at this position where the knight moved to f6 and e5 was played by white, another option is to move bishop to g5, and then here there are multiple options for black. One possibility is to capture in the center and relieve some of that pressure, and it may continue with knight captures and now breaking this pin that the bishop had on the f6 knight. But here we notice that the bishop captures instead of the knight capturing knight. And so white gives up his bishop, which was a bad bishop anyway, because it was blocked in by its central pawn that was on the same color square that this bishop controls. And so we have a trade here where black's good bishop is traded, or excuse me, white captures the bad bishop that white had. And so white is left with this very well placed knight in the center, which was more valuable than his bad bishop, which he let black capture. And so development by white, castling. Already black has castled, and white develops his bishop to c4, and white's ready to castle as well. So in this position, we see that both sides, black is castled and white is about ready to castle. And so here there may be play down this d file, since this pawn has been exchanged with the e4 pawn early in the game. And black may choose to move to c6 to restrict this central pawn, or may try this thematic c5 pawn push to attack the d4 pawn. And white may choose to bolster this center pawn with c3 and possibly castle queenside and attempt the opposite side castling variation, where both sides are racing to break through on opposite sides. And now if we go back and look at, in this position where bishop to g5 was played and immediately white captured, which is what we just went over, another option is for black to play bishop to e7 immediately and break this pin. And here white can push forward, chasing this knight away. And here white can trade his bad bishop, which would be blocked in behind central pawns, with white can trade his bad bishop for black's good bishop, which is on the opposite color as his central pawns. And so exchange, queen captures, and here, once again, white pushes this f pawn to bolster the e5 pawn, because if there is a c5 push, capturing this d pawn, that pawn can no longer protect this central e5 pawn, and so the f4 pawn was pushed to protect this. And so castling, queen moves out, allowing white to castle queenside. Black puts pressure on that d4 pawn, and knight to f3 to back up the center. More pressure on the d4 pawn. and queenside castling by white. And once again, we have this opposite side castling. And the game may continue with moves such as knight to b6, trying to slowly position his knights and his pieces down towards the queen side for an attack on white's king. And breaking of the tension in the middle by capturing. Queen captures. Development of the bishop now aimed up at the king side. And something we always want to watch out for in the French defense, in many variations, it is possible for the classic bishop sacrifice, where this bishop will capture on h7, and then when the king recaptures, the pieces can funnel in behind that bishop capture with an attack. The knight can move up to g5, checking. The queen may be able to jump in and follow up in the attack. And so bishop to d7, and then here we have this bishop sacrifice. King captures and the follow-up attack. Knight to g5. King retreats, and now the queen positions itself, threatening a checkmate. And instead of blocking with this g-pawn, black takes the option of creating an escape route for the king by moving his rook. And so the attack continues with check by the queen. The king attempts to flee, and before further attacking with queen to h8, white moves his rook to e1 to cover this e3 square and prevent any surprise checks by the queen, possibly checking and capturing this f-pawn, and then possibly destroying white's center by capturing the e5 pawn. And so the game continued after this rook to e1 move. Queen to b4, repositioning the queen, now threatening the f4 pawn. Check by white's queen, and the king flees. And now here we have an interesting move. Instead of the queen just immediately capturing this g7 pawn, he moves to h4 to line up on the king, threatening a discovered attack once the knight is moved. And so the king moves, knight captures, and here we have a discovered double check on the king. And so the king retreats. And I won't go any further in this game because I still have some more variations to cover, but this was a very interesting possibility of an attack, and a reminder to always watch out if you're playing the black side of the French defense, to be aware of the possibility of a bishop sacrifice on h7 and a follow-up with the knight to g5 or the queen coming to the h-file to follow up on that bishop sacrifice. Okay, and now if we go back and look at, let's see, we'll go back further here. So we looked at the bishop to g5 move and bishop to e7. And so let's see what other possibilities there are. Bear with me here for a minute as I look. So we looked at the exchange in the center. We looked at bishop to e7. And another possibility, we looked at chasing the knight away with a pawn push in the center. And I don't think we looked at this yet. So one possibility is after e4, e6, d4, d5, and this knight to f6 move, it was a pawn push to e5, chasing this knight back. And let me go back and play through these moves from the beginning before I confuse anybody. So e4, e6, d4, d5. And then after knight to c3, it is possible after knight to f6 and e5 and a retreat with knight to d7. In this position, we looked at an f4 move by white, but he may also retreat this knight. And he does this to counter this c5 pawn push. Now he is not restricting his c-pawn, and so play would continue with this c5 pawn push attacking d4, and now white is able to protect it with his c-pawn. And more pressure on that d4 point in the middle here. And because this pawn may be lost at some point and it protects the e5 pawn, this f4 pawn push is always good to help bolster and strengthen that e5 pawn. And trade in the middle, the queen applying more pressure. And then we have knight to f3 to help cover the center. And here, more pressure on this e5 pawn. And so a3, and this move may prevent the black pieces from coming in onto a white side of the board, preventing the knights from moving forward and preventing this bishop from checking. And so continuation may be bishop to e7, knight to c3. And so here both sides are repositioning. Castle by black. And here an interesting maneuver, a knight to the edge of the board, chasing the queen. And so the queen retreats. So this is one possibility where the knight that was on c3 repositioned to allow this c-pawn to help cover this d4 pawn. And let me go back to the beginning and see if there was anything that I missed and haven't covered. So e4, e6, d4, d5. And here we went over the knight to c3 variations, in which this knight covers the center. Also, white has the option of moving the knight to d2, covering the center pawn and not blocking in his c-pawn. So here the c-pawn is free to cover the center and protect the d4 pawn. We also looked at this, after this, instead of knight to c3 or knight to d2, we looked at e5, the advanced variation, where white immediately grabs space in the center and play will revolve around these locked pawns. Many times c5 will be played to attack. We also looked at the exchange variation, which was an immediate exchange in the center by white. Black captures. And here, the only advantage that white has is the first move. So he's developing one piece ahead of black. And so it is a lot harder to find an advantage in this position, as both sides are pretty equal. And the battle may take place up and down this E file. And so if we go back to the beginning, after E4, E5, or excuse me, E4, E6, D4, D5, and here, knight to C3, we looked at the win hour variation with bishop to B4 and how that leads to crazy attacking games, usually on both sides. And another option, instead of the win hour, which was bishop to B4, instead of that, black may play knight to F6. And here the game may play out with an E5 push immediately, or a bishop move pinning the knight. And let's see, we also covered the D takes E4 maneuver early in the game, and after knight takes E4, the position is different, where white has more space in the center than black, but the game is more open. There's more freedom to maneuver. And next, we'll look at the Fort Knox variation. So in this position, after white has captured in the center, one of the main problems in the French defense is this bishop on C8 being blocked in by its own pawns. So in the Fort Knox variation, black will attempt to immediately get this bishop out and release it from behind this E6 pawn, and the game will commence like this. White develops his knight, and so this bishop moves immediately to get out to the C6 square, and now it is eyeing this long diagonal down to white's king side. And so white develops, and play may continue with some more developing moves. C3 to bolster the center D4 pawn, knight to F6, and some exchanges. Castling by white, and this bad bishop is exchanged off. And here the queen recaptures, and a battle in the center between the queens. And so here black is not worried if white takes. He can recapture with his pawn if he likes, and play may occur down the E file, and it gives black more space if white captures the queen and he recaptures with his pawn. So queen retreats, and here we have bishop to E7, and now black may castle on either side. And so white moves his rook to the E file to help take control of that. Castle on the king side by black, bishop to F4, so just completing development of the pieces. And here we have this solid defensive structure by black, which is seen in other openings, where you have a C6 pawn and an E6 pawn, and it prevents this D pawn from moving forward. And this is just a pretty solid structure for black. And so the center is locked up for now, and so white pushes to gain more space on the queen side. But this is one example of how this Fort Knox variation may play out. And so if we go back, the Fort Knox variation was this. And we also looked at knight to D7. in which knight takes f6, bishop to d3, bishop to e7, castling. All right, I think I've covered most of these lines. You'll have to forgive me. I maybe dove too deep into this. So if anybody is interested in more specific variations, I tried to cover a lot all at once, and maybe it was too much. I hope people aren't confused. Feel free to rewatch the video and try and look at little pieces or whatever opening variation you're interested in. And if there wasn't enough detail on any specific variation, please feel free to leave comments on something more specific or one variation that you would like to see more information on, and I can possibly do a video with more specifics on a single variation. And so anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, even though it was quite long, on the French defense, and that it gave you some type of introduction. And so if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe, leave comments, any questions you have or concerns, and I will respond. And I hope everybody has a great day and tries out the French defense. Thank you.